All right, hi, my name is Jessica Marra. It's September 21st, and I'm here with Scott Greenwood in the Cleveland office of the ACLU of Ohio. How are you doing today?
Great. Hi, Jessica.
Let's start with some very basic, easy background questions. When and where were you born?
I was born in Dayton in 1963.
And can you talk a little bit about your family life growing up?
I had a great family life growing up. My father is a retired school principal, and when I was a kid, he was an elementary school principal. And my mother worked in various positions, all related to computer systems analysis. She ended up at LexisNexis. So, I was a product of a two-parent household. I had two younger brothers. It was sort of a stereotypical nuclear family, what at least we thought of as a stereotypical family in the 60s and 70s.
And can you talk about your education?
Sure. I mean, my law degree is from Chicago, where I got a Juris Doctorate in 1989, and I was a Bradley Fellow in Law and Government at Chicago. My undergraduate degrees are from Miami University here in Ohio, where I have degrees in classical humanities and Latin.
That's very interesting. And so how did you get involved in civil liberties? What made you interested in that?
I had always been really socially conscious and politically conscious. I mean, as I think a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old, I was helping my grandmother pass out political leaflets and flyers. I read the newspaper starting at around the same time, and it was just sort of always in my consciousness.
And was your family environment was sort of nurturing of your civil liberties interests?
Very much so, because when I was a kid, my father was one of the first people to help desegregate the Dayton city schools. And so it was a very tumultuous period in the country and certainly in the school district at the time. And so we had a variety of people, social friends and business or work acquaintances that interacted with my dad and my mom and my family. So we always had African Americans and Caucasians and anybody else in my home, and it was just perfectly normal. It was just part of my upbringing.
And how did you get involved with the ACLU?
I first started doing some work with the ACLU when I was in law school. I mean, first I think I passed some things out for the Illinois affiliate when I was in Chicago. And then after I graduated from law school, and I was working in a very large, stuffy law firm in Cincinnati, I knew I had to do something else. I knew I did not go to law school so I could sit in an office, make money, and work on issues that I didn't care anything about. And so at some point I got invited to go to a legal panel or a legal committee meeting in Cincinnati. That was really sort of my first formal involvement. And
I know you've had a lot of different roles at the ACLU. Can you sort of talk about the different things you've done here?
They've been, every one of them has been interesting. Like I said, I did work on the legal panel in Cincinnati. I eventually chaired it. Back then, we really had chapters that were more or less their own islands when it came to program activity. And so I chaired that legal panel, and we analyzed potential cases and suggested them and made recommendations to the state office and then the state board, which then would authorize or approve those cases. That was a whole lot of fun. I did that for years and years. I joined the affiliate board in 1992. I think this is actually this meeting is the 20th anniversary of my joining the affiliate board, so that's been a very long time. I briefly served as the vice president of the affiliate for a couple of years. That doesn't really bring back very many memories. I may have run a meeting once when the president was absent, but I've been on the executive committee of the affiliate since '93, so I've been very involved in affiliate governance ever since. I was general counsel for the affiliate from 2000. Let me get this right. From 1997 to 2004. So that was a terrific period. I would say that I probably had the most hands-on involvement in my experience with the affiliate when I was its general counsel, because the general counsel then really did have to supervise the litigation that our lawyers, our staff lawyers, our legal director, and our volunteers did throughout the state. That was a tremendous amount of fun.
And what specifically is your role right now?
Now I am one of the general counsel for the National ACLU and on the executive committee of the National ACLU. I also sit as the Ohio representative on the national board, and I've done that since 2004. I was elected general counsel not that long after joining the national board, and I've done that now for 6 or 7 years.
And what is it like being a representative of Ohio on the national board? Is it ever difficult? I know that sometimes Ohio and the national board take different positions on things.
Well, one thing that we have in the organization is this concept of unity without unanimity. So different affiliates take different positions on different issues, and that's okay as long as they're consistent with an overall civil liberties view. Ohio doesn't tend to have very many differences with the national organization now, but at various points in time it certainly did. I remember a case that was in the Supreme Court in which the national organization took one position and the Ohio affiliate with 3 or 4 other ones took the polar opposite position, and we each filed briefs on each side of the case. So we don't tend to have that happen very much anymore.
Let's talk about some specific things that you've worked on, some of your specific sort of crusades that you've been on. Can you talk about your work for LGBTQ rights, specifically talking about Cincinnati's Issue 3 in the 90s?
Right. In 1992, the Cincinnati City Council enacted a human rights ordinance. It was actually one of the most progressive at the time in the country, and it added LGB people into the city's existing human rights ordinance for coverage. It was a politically fraught decision, and I think the strategists and activists didn't really know what was going to happen next. Well, what happened next was the radical right came down hard and launched a massive campaign, a political campaign, to repeal that portion of the human rights ordinance. And then they went further, just as it happened in Colorado with Amendment 2 and in Oregon with another measure. The radical right went further, and they put a charter amendment onto the ballot that would not just repeal those portions of the human rights ordinance, but it would actually require LGBT activists to go back to the electorate to get any type of recognition or any type of legal protection at all. It was an incredibly ugly campaign. In the midst of that campaign, I was serving the campaign as an informal legal advisor, and ultimately the ACLU of Ohio spearheaded the challenge to the charter amendment once it was enacted. And I was privileged to serve as our lead counsel for the ACLU of Ohio.
And can you talk about how that all turned out?
Well, I mean, it was this really tumultuous time. I mean, I'm gay, and I was personally targeted as a result of this activity. It was very ugly. I was booted out of my law firm during this time frame, literally escorted to the elevator and shown the door with maybe half an hour's notice. That was just breathtaking. But in retrospect, it was terrific because it was liberating. All of a sudden, I got to work on the things that really mattered to me, and I got to devote my energies to protecting people's rights rather than taking them away.
Another thing I know that you worked a lot on was the Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement.
Yes.
Can you talk about the background on that and how that all came about?
The ACLU nationally has been involved in almost all of the racial profiling or race-biased policing cases since the late 80s. And I had, when I was the affiliate general counsel, I had looked at those cases and some of the consent decrees that had started to come about. And some of them were really quite good, and they were the result of work that our affiliates in other places had done. But the one thing that was really missing was a tie to the local community, the people who would be policed, so that any reforms would be sustainable. So I put together a challenge with colleagues, and we took over an existing case brought a number of other cases, consolidated it into it, and then we launched a massive project with the people that we were suing to try to reach agreement on issues of systemic reform. We ended up with 2 different agreements, a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Justice and with what we call the collaborative agreement, which was aspirational and really went farther than traditional use of force reforms and reporting requirements. It actually aimed to restructure the relationship between the police department and the community. And it turned out to be a slog for a few years, but ultimately it was wildly successful, and it is now considered the gold standard model for police reform in the United States. I would say that is that's the work of which I'm the most proud.
Do you still live in Cincinnati now?
I do.
So do you still sort of see that it's working now?
It's absolutely working. There's a park that was recently redone in Cincinnati in our Over the Rhine neighborhood. It went from being a shooting gallery. It was inhabited mostly by homeless people and drug users. It was avoided by most neighborhood residents. It was a quite dangerous place. There was constant police activity. It has been redone, reopened, and the local business district where people used to fear to go has been redeveloped and opened up, and people are moving in, and it's a very diverse area now. 10 years ago, you would not have wanted to walk across that park alone, and you would not have probably ventured up a couple of those streets. Now it's one of the most vibrant districts in the city. I was talking to a colleague very recently, and his response was, none of this would have been possible without the success of the collaborative agreement.
Kind of going along with that, you've also done a lot for the rights of prisoners. So can you talk about the rapid indictment issue that you worked on?
There was about 12 or 13 years ago a desire by the local prosecutor to eliminate the first hearing that a prisoner has upon arrest. They wanted to skip an arraignment or an initial appearance and hold people upon arrest until they were indicted. They didn't want to have to lay out their case early on. They said it was too expensive. So what they did was to try to circumvent that by changing a rule. They got every judge in the municipal court to agree to dispense with these hearings. So, of course, the ACLU sued. And ultimately, we got the judges, the presiding judge, to issue an order restoring these preliminary hearings to people. They had to at least inform them that they had the right to have them. That was probably the closest that I ever came to being jailed for contempt by a federal judge who was not happy with our work in that area. But it was absolutely worth it. He was one of my favorite judges. He was 4 feet 11 inches tall. But when he put on a black robe, he was 10 feet tall. And he stood in his chambers right up in my face and was yelling at me. And I tried to diffuse the tension by saying, Judge, when I'm in your courtroom, I always pack my toothbrush just in case. So, my role is to come right up to the line. That's what my clients need me to do.
That's great. That's a great story. Thank you. I guess another thing that you were involved with that I want to talk about is the separation of church and state. I know there was a case you worked on with the KKK putting a cross in a public area. Can you talk about that? I would say it's an unfortunate case, but it's an absolutely necessary case. In the early 90s, there was a lot more of this activity around the country, and Klan groups were pretty active in trying to display. It was sort of the last vestiges of Klan groups, of overt activity by Klan groups. And in response to the placement on the downtown public square in Cincinnati called Fountain Square of a menorah for Hanukkah by a Jewish religious group, a local Klan group decided that it wanted to display a cross. And so it sought approval for a permit to do so. And the city did exactly the wrong thing. They made it into a big
eventful drama and passed an ordinance. I think there were actually 2 different ordinances at different times that were designed to keep the Klan away from the square and allow the city to issue permits based upon the inoffensiveness of the proposed speech. So, of course, we brought a suit representing 2 or 3 different individual Klan members as well as one of the entities. And we got a terrific opinion out of the 6th Circuit and out of the District Court. At one point, there were 3 Klan cases pending in the U.S., one in Cincinnati, one in Columbus, and one in Texas. And I used to joke with colleagues, only the ACLU can represent these people. They're not smart enough to have their own lawyers, but what's really brilliant about it is the Klan is being represented in these 3 cases by a Jewish person, a Jewish lawyer, a gay one, and an African American. And I thought that was just brilliant, and it shows exactly why the ACLU is necessary to protect First Amendment rights.
Yeah, when we interviewed Larry Herman last week, he's Jewish, and he mentioned representing the KKK in court, and he said, "This is what we do. We protect free speech."
We protect free speech. I don't need them to invite me to their holiday parties.
So that kind of goes along with another one of my questions about this tension between free speech and hate crimes and how the ACLU traditionally handles that. Because I know that in the past, the Ohio chapter has said it's free speech, it's always free speech, and the national chapter has sometimes said not in the case of a hate crime.
I think that we actually had a better case in Cleveland that illustrates that tension. At the same time that we had the Klan case in Cincinnati, we also had an effort by the Nation of Islam to put on a public event in the convention center in Cleveland. And the nation segregates its people, its attendees by gender. So men are on one side, women are on another. And the city didn't want the nation to do this at all. They didn't want them to come. They're too controversial. So they used equal rights on the basis of gender or equal protection as a reason to deny a permit. So you had this perfect tension between free speech rights and equal protection rights. That, I think, and we took the position that the city couldn't use one right to trump another one. You don't use one right in order to squelch another one. And I think that is the approach that's been most consistent with the Ohio affiliate. So when we've had discussions on things like hate crimes, we have taken exactly the same position. You can punish somebody for what they do. You cannot punish them for what they think.
Switching tracks a little, when I was doing research for this interview, I read a lot of quotes that you gave to newspapers and things like that. So how do you deal with being a spokesperson for the ACLU, and do you ever get any negative feedback or pushback from people because of that?
Not really. It's more rare than it used to be because we've grown our staff presence nationally and in Ohio. So there are people on staff who are always available to give sound bites to the press when they need them. I like being asked to speak on behalf of the organization. I think because I've done literally everything within the organization, from volunteer attorney up to the highest levels of elected leadership in the national organization, that I'm pretty conversant with all of our work, and I'm happy to talk about any of it. So it's always fun.
And kind of going off that, can you talk about how you see the organization in Ohio and as a whole, since you're involved with the national organization, how you see it has changed in the time you've been involved with it?
When I joined the Ohio board in 1992, the very first vote that I had to take as a member of the board was to eliminate a senior staff position because of our deficit. And today, at the time, it was we had to lay off the executive director, the legal director, or our legislative lobbyist. That's what it came down to. Very specific choices about program that were coupled with people that were tied to specific dollar amounts. And that's how dire things were at the time. Most of our work, our legal work, was done by volunteers. And our legislative presence was one person and a few volunteers. That's where we were then. We also had we had real estate. We had offices in Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, and occasionally there would be staffed or partially staffed offices elsewhere. Fast forward 20 years, we have one of the largest endowments of any of the ACLU affiliates. We have a large staff that is based in Cleveland, but also has a very large presence in Central Ohio. We have much less work done by our cooperating attorneys today because we have 2 or 3 lawyers on staff most of the time. So that's been a very significant presence and very huge change. We do much better with our development work in this century than we did the last. We have professionalized our ability to raise funds for the future health of the organization. And so these are very, very big changes.
Do you see the organization changing in the way it responds to changing politics and changing public opinion, and how it's sort of its presence in the community?
Its presence is very different now than it used to be. We had more of a chapter-based organization in Ohio that was that's how the Ohio affiliate came about. You had presence on the ground in local communities where there were enough people to be interested. And traditionally, that's how civil liberties issues would bubble up and get the attention of the state office. And it's not really like that anymore. I mean, now we have a centralized office, and we have the immediate ability to communicate with our members and with influence makers and policy makers and elected officials in ways that we could have only dreamed of 20 years ago. We can mobilize tens of thousands of people with a few keystrokes, and that's not something that we were able to do when I first started with the organization.
Throughout your time in Ohio and with the national organization, have you met any memorable people, sort of like big shots in the ACLU? Can you talk about that?
I am constantly amazed by the depth and the extent of people's skills and knowledge and dedication inside the ACLU. At the Ohio level, I have known and worked with people like David Goldberger, Benson Wolff, Julie Davis, Jeff Gamzo, Chris Link, Sue Carter, Susan Becker. I don't want to leave anybody out, but there have been phenomenal people who are really giants in the field whose contributions to civil liberties you cannot overstate. There was a volunteer lawyer who knew nothing about the First Amendment but signed up to work with me on one of our establishment cases in Southwest Ohio. It was the 10 Commandments case that led to all those 10 Commandments signs all over the country once they put them out in front of the school district. He was so dedicated because he realized this was wrong, it was a violation of people's rights, that he relearned constitutional law, because that's not what his practice area was, so he could work on this case. And even when he was in the throes of very serious cancer, he was able to make it and prepare for appellate argument in the U.S. Court of Appeals. I mean, that's real heroism, and there's no shortage of that in the ACLU. And on the national level, I am constantly awed by some of the people that I've been honored to work with. Nadine Strawson was the president, Susan Herman, the current president, the general counsels that I've been privileged to serve with, Frank Askin, Vivian Berger, Susan again, and others. There are some tremendous people in the organization. I think if you want to look at the intellectual capacity of an organization, we have to be right up there at the top, because we just have an amazing cast of characters that have done amazing things for the organization and ultimately for the country.
You mentioned Benson Wolff. Can you talk about, did you work on anything specific with him? Did you just meet him?
Benson was on the national board. He was the Ohio representative to the national board when I first met him. And people always thought that Benson had practiced law forever, and he didn't. I think we were 1 year apart at different law schools. He returned to life quite late as a lawyer, but he had been the executive director of the Ohio ACLU when it was based in Columbus. But Benson actually did one of the cases for us. He did one of the Klan cases. He and David Goldberger did one that went to the Supreme Court, and they sort of necessarily, out of time, were able to use some of the work that I had already just done in Cincinnati. So I got to work with them in the early stages of that case, and then I got to supervise it as he and David went to the Supreme Court in that case. So that was a tremendous privilege as well.
Have you ever gotten to argue in front of the Supreme Court?
Not yet. I've had my name on a whole lot of things that go there.
Is that something you want to do, or is that like, I hope things get resolved before it goes that far?
No, I've moved in a slightly different direction, I think, over the years. As one of the general counsel, I get to supervise all the work that the ACLU does nationally in the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Just the other day, I was in D.C. where we did our annual Supreme Court press breakfast, and one of our lawyers, Jamil Jaffer, was there. He's quite nervous because he has an argument in the Supreme Court next week. So we're all talking together about how these things go, and it's very gratifying. It's just as gratifying to supervise it from 30,000 feet as it is, I think, to do it on the ground. But given the chance, sure, I'd like to take my turn in the room.
So can you talk a little bit about the culture of the National Board right now? I know we spoke with Larry. He was on the National Board in like the 60s right. and the 70s. He said it was a very intellectual sort of a group of professors. Is it kind of the same way now, or has it changed?
There are a lot of professors, law professors and others. It is a very intellectual group. It spends an inordinate amount of time on debating the finer parts of policy, substantive policies of the organization. Candidly, I think most of that work has been done. And so it's not as effective as a board, as a governing board, as it could be. I mean, to that end, I'm participating in a governance overhaul process for the National Board.
And where do you hope to see the board go?
I want to give the ACLU the type of board that I think it needs in the 21st century, that is smaller, less deliberative, but more engaged in doing development work, partnering with the staff, and really providing top-level oversight, but not micromanagement of this huge and important organization. The ACLU, the National ACLU, is a $100 million a year program. And if you add all the affiliates in as well, it's a $200 million a year program. That makes us the biggest civil rights and civil liberties group on the planet. Yet we have a pretty cumbersome structure as a board, so it's kind of difficult to get many things done as a board. The real action, candidly, for governance is at the executive committee level, and it's just a few people, and we get things done. But the National Board spends a great deal of time talking.
Sort of winding down with a few general reminiscences, do you have a favorite memory or something that you recall fondly that you were involved in? Anyone you met or something you participated in?
I have different memories of different times. I know during the Issue 3 litigation in Cincinnati, and I was quite a bit younger. I was almost 20 years younger. And it was nice because I was a junior lawyer still. I'd only practiced 3 or 4 years, and I had a huge amount of responsibility. And I was seen by so many gay and lesbian people in Cincinnati as a hero for what I did. And I thought at the time, I would walk into a restaurant and people would applaud. It was very gratifying, but it was also very humbling because I realized the trust that had been placed in me and our team in trying to protect people. But I also had some unpleasant memories too. I had somebody spit in my face for the work that I was doing for the Klan case in '93. I mean, somebody looked at me, asked me if I represented these people, and spat in my face. That I was about the same place as she was in terms of what I thought of my own client. But I had to explain to her why it was important for me to do that. So I would say I would do it all again, and I would do it without hesitation.
And what do you hope to see accomplished by the time you're done being associated with the ACLU? Do you have any specific goals in mind for the organization?
I want the organization, the ACLU of Ohio and the National ACLU, to become permanent presences in our nation. They literally cannot go away, that they are so well funded and well run that they become institutions. They become institutions unto themselves. So they're a permanent presence in the fabric of our country and our state. And part of that is development, part of that is governance, part of that is strategic oversight. And when all those things come together, I think I'll know that it's time to go.
We're working on summarizing some important cases that were worked on in Ohio for our website. Are there any that you can think of that I didn't mention that you think we should put out there and summarize on the website?
Of my cases, those would be the main ones, I think. Those are really the main ones.
Okay. All right. I think I've gotten to most of those. So
there was one I remember doing, again, very fondly. It was getting an order from, no, two other ones. There was getting a pregnant inmate access to have her taken to a hospital to give birth and not be chained.
Okay.
And allowing her husband access to the birth.
I think I remember reading about this.
She had given an interview to a newspaper, and in retaliation, the jail locked her up in more restrictions and was not going to allow her to give birth without being in shackles, and was going to ban her husband. We did that case in the dead of night because it was time sensitive. I went with staff lawyers to the what they called the pre-release center, where the female inmate was kept pending. She was right at the end of her sentence, but she was definitely going to have this baby before she was released. So she wasn't really a security risk. She was a drug offender anyway. She was not a danger to anyone. So the idea that she was going to be shackled to a bed to give birth as sort of a final humiliation was really unseemly. And all night we called the Attorney General. We called various judges that we were trying to reach to apply for a TRO. And we sometimes would drop connections with the judge. There was a judge we ended up before. Cell phones were not as great in those days, and you would lose them every time somebody went up or down a hill. And that's what happened. And we ended up doing a TRO pretty much in the middle of the night and getting it. And that was gratifying. I mean, getting a real result for people was quite gratifying.
All right. I guess, is there anything else you want to discuss that I've not asked you about? Any important things that you worked on that I hadn't managed to dig up in my research?
You've covered a lot, I think. You've covered a lot. I mean, you remind me of some things I've forgotten. So many of these cases over the years. I mean, it is safe to say that the cases that I've had the most fun with in my career so far have all been cases I've done as a volunteer for the ACLU. All of them.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.